greatest joy and privilege, really, to have been given this opportunity and this great honor to come and meet with you friends. I was mentioning last night to some of you who were there that when I was a child, I grew up amongst the early believers, and they could never conceive, they could never believe in their or use their imagination that one day the believers from all over the world, and especially from Europe and America, people will embrace this faith. Because in those days the faith was completely limited to a few countries in the East. And when you think of it, really, one of the greatest proofs of this revelation is that in a small, little, dirty, filthy prison, a dungeon in Tehran, the light of this great revelation broke upon that terrible dark dungeon. And who would have imagined in those days that light will shine all over the world and reach to these remote places, as far as Tehran is concerned, the Siachal of Tehran, and will illumine the hearts of many, many people and bring in a new creation. And now you can see the results of this, how the faith has spread, how the power of Baha'u'llah has penetrated into the hearts of peoples all over the world. This is something which I really appreciated very much, perhaps more than all of you, because I remember those days when we were so few and when the faith was limited to just those lands remote, far, far from here, their culture different, their background different. And now look at what's happened. The world has been conquered by Baha'u'llah. He has created a new race of men. And you are the new race of men, really. And for me, therefore, it's the greatest privilege, really, to be able to look into your faces on behalf of the early believers who would have loved to see one European or American believer in their lives. They would have loved to gaze upon the face of a person who says, I believe in Baha'u'llah, coming from the Western world. Well, friends, I feel that this weekend we are going to be together, hopefully, to go through some of the most important, in my view, aspects of our faith. It is marvelous to be a Baha'i, but we have a great challenge, and the challenge is to grow in the faith, that our faith may grow day by day. This is, I think, the challenge to every person. And if our faith does not grow every day, then it's not good. It's like a child which is born. That child must grow. If the child does not grow, then it's not healthy. And this is why Baha'u'llah has mentioned in his writings, he says that we must make our life in such a way that the morning would be better than the previous evening, and tomorrow would be better than today. And we have to feel it. And this is, I think, the challenge to all of us. Perhaps it's easy to be a Baha'i or to become a Baha'i, but it is very difficult to grow as a Baha'i. Look back upon the earlier days, one can feel that one has grown in the faith. And nobody can say that I've grown enough. Nobody. As long as we live here, we have the scope to grow. Now I thought to perhaps share with you some of these basic thoughts. Now, do not think for one moment that I have got all this know-how, that I have achieved all of these things. All I'm trying to do is from the writings of Baha'u'llah and the writings and the history of the faith and the history of the believers to just bring to your notice what we can do to grow. And I feel that one of the subjects which we should first begin with, and it's a subject which is really a very important subject, which we often do not think about. And I'm not talking of Baha'is, but especially of the non-Baha'is of the outside world. They seldom think or care about this subject, and that is about our soul. Because everything begins with the soul, really. And I think it is time that we paid some attention to find out what is the soul, to look at it, to see what condition it is. What condition is it now, really, our souls? And in order to start this subject, I wanted to mention that in order to appreciate spiritual realities, we should look at two things. If you want to understand the spiritual principle, a spiritual reality, you should look at two things. And look at them very carefully. One is nature, and one is the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha. And when you put the two together, then we can understand many spiritual realities. Nature can teach us an awful lot, because God's creation is one entity. God has not created two different worlds, the spiritual world separate and the physical world separate. It's not like this. He has created one entity. The spiritual and the physical world is one and the same. And the laws which run through this creation are the same laws. The same laws that run in nature, exactly the same laws apply in the spiritual realms. The same laws that apply that you will find them in nature, the same laws are operative in religion. Every one of the major teachings of Baha'u'llah has its origin in nature. Every one of his teachings. It is very natural. Religion is very natural. The laws that run within the world of man, within our world, are also have their origin in nature. We can learn a great deal from nature. But each one of these laws are applied on a higher and higher level as you go higher and higher into the spiritual realms. Do you see? A certain law you find in nature, that law finds its application in the spiritual worlds, and but it has added features to it. It's to be applied on a higher level, but it is the same law. And so, if you know something physical, if you can understand the law of nature, you can understand something of its spiritual laws. Provided you read the writings. I mentioned that. Because if you don't, then you can get lost in your efforts to rationalize things and to bring in your rational faculties into it and try to compare things. You could get lost. But if you read the writings and then look at nature, then we can understand many spiritual realities. Now I will give you an example of this, just to give you an example of how the laws of God are the same in the physical world and the spiritual worlds. I'll give you one example, just an example. All the laws which govern the creation of a tree, for example, are the same laws as those which are used in the creation of man. The same principles, the same laws apply to the two things. They are very much counterparts of each other. A tree and a man. You see, the tree will drive its roots down into the ground to receive its sustenance, to get its sustenance. It's from the ground, because everything depends on the roots going down into the ground. It depends, its food comes from there. But the tree itself, as if it dislikes the ground. The ground is a very dirty place. It's a low, one of the lowest kingdoms. And this tree has no choice but to receive all its sustenance from this dirty soil. But the tree itself doesn't like the soil. It goes in the opposite direction. You noticed? It's as if it dislikes this earth. It moves in the opposite direction. And when it moves in the opposite directions, what happens? It receives the most beautiful thing of all. It receives the rays of the sun. Can you imagine the difference between the rays of the sun and the dirt of the soil? It receives the rays of the sun, and as a result of it, it produces beautiful flowers and beautiful fruits, just because it detached itself from this earth, disliked this earth. It moves in the other direction. If the tree would have said, well, I owe everything to this earth, my food comes from this earth, I love this earth, I'll go into it myself, well, then this wouldn't be a tree. It wouldn't be a tree. It would never receive the rays of the sun. Now this is exactly, can you see the exact parallel with the creation of man? We have to live in this world. It's just like this dirty soil for the tree, this earth, this world that we live in. We have to earn a living. We have to live in this world. But, and we have to get our food, our sustenance, our livelihood from this world. But the soul does not like this world, should not like this world. And that it should move, it should dislike it. It should really become detached from this earth and focus its attention in the opposite direction. And if we do that, if we become detached from the things of this world, then the rays of the sun of truth will shine upon us, and then our soul will produce beautiful fruits, you see, just like the tree. But if I attach myself to the things of this world, then there is no such a thing as the rays of the sun of truth shining upon me. Now here you see the difference. There's exactly the same principles, but with one difference. I mentioned that the laws which govern the physical nature and the laws which govern the spiritual world are the same, but they have added features. You see, in the tree, in the example of the tree, you will find the tree has no choice but to grow in the opposite direction. It just grows in the opposite direction. That's the way it's made. But we have an added dimension to this particular law given to us, and that is choice, free will. We have the choice of either going down into this earth or going the opposite, or growing in the opposite direction. It's up to us to choose. If we choose to go into the opposite direction, then you become spiritual. If you go into this, attach yourself to the things of this world, you become attached to material things. But the choice is up to us. Now this, I gave you just an example to share with you how the laws of nature and the laws of higher realms are the same. But they have got different, they have to be applied on different levels. Now, we go back to our own story. We wanted to really understand the soul. We were going this morning to really try and discover what is our soul, so that we can recognize ourselves, so that we can understand our place in life. Again, in order to understand the soul, we must examine another principle. And that principle is what Baha'u'llah mentions. He says that in this life, everything in this physical world is a counterpart of something spiritual. Everything you see in this life is not something which is coming to us in a haphazard way. For instance, we were talking of the tree. The tree is not just something isolated that God has created in this physical realm. You can be sure it has parallels, it has counterparts in all the realms of God. This is only a reflection. The tree is only a reflection of something spiritual in the spiritual worlds. So everything has a counterpart. And if you can study the counterpart of something, you can understand the other counterpart. If you study anything in nature, you can study its counterpart in the spiritual realms. Do you see what I mean? For instance, Baha'u'llah mentions that the sun is a counterpart of a manifestation of God. What the sun does to this earth, a manifestation of God does to man. So the sun, he says, which is a physical thing, is a counterpart of a manifestation of God. If you want to study the manifestation of God, therefore, to understand something about the manifestation of God, you can study the sun. Really, if you really study the sun, and I mean studying it, you will get a lot of insight into the working of a manifestation of God. Because these two are counterparts. Now, we want to find out what is the counterpart, what is our soul. But you see, the soul is a spiritual entity. It's not a material thing. And if you want to understand our soul, which is a spiritual entity, we have to try, if we could, find a counterpart for it in this physical life and study that physical thing. If we could find that counterpart and study that physical thing in this life, then we could apply it, all its characteristics, the characteristics of its counterpart in the spiritual realm. Do I make myself clear or follow? You see that the soul, as I said, is not a material thing. It's not something you can push it into your body and pull it out of your body. It's not something you can take it to a laboratory to test it for you. It is, Baha'u'llah says, the soul is an emanation from the worlds of God. An emanation from the spiritual worlds of God. So now, where are we? We want to find a physical counterpart for the soul. There we turn to the writings. Where we turn to the writings. And when you turn to the writings, and when you study the writings, it appears to us, that's all I can say, it appears to us. When you read the writings, it appears that the counterpart of the soul, which is the spiritual thing, its counterpart in this physical world, is the embryo growing in the womb of the mother. Whatever happens to the embryo, thank you very much, whatever happens to the embryo growing in the womb of the mother, the same thing happens to the soul. You see, but one is a spiritual thing and one is a physical thing. But now we know everything about the embryo growing in the womb of the mother. And so we can understand from it a lot of parallel points which could apply to the soul. If you could give me a piece of paper, I want to make notes. Some of the things I forget and it comes to my mind, and sorry for, thank you very much. Now we'll take the first point. Baha'u'llah mentions that the soul comes into this life, it's created by God at the same time of conception. When a child is conceived and the first cell is created in the embryo, physical cell, the soul of man is also created at the same time. That the soul of man did not exist before. This is one of the basic truths which Baha'u'llah has revealed to us. It did not have an existence before, but that it was created at the time of conception. In the same way that the cell did not exist before, but it came into being at the time of conception. And these two things are related together. They are associated with each other. Because the soul, being a spiritual entity, cannot enter into anything. You cannot say, my soul entered my body. You cannot use the word to describe it even. It cannot have any relationship, in fact, with the body. But it is somehow associated with it. And Abdul Baha describes it as, he says it's similar to the association of light in the mirror. The soul in the body is the same thing, he says. It's the same example he gives, is like the light in the mirror. When you look at the mirror, you cannot put your hand in the mirror and pull the light out. You can't touch it. It's not in the mirror. The reflection, the light is not in the mirror, but it is somewhat associated with it, reflected on it. And if you break the mirror, nothing happens to the light. And Baha'u'llah tells us that it's the same thing with the soul. It's associated with us. It's a spiritual thing. It cannot have any relationship with our body other than just being associated. And even you cannot say associated because you cannot use word to describe it in any way. But whatever it is, we know that, let us say, the nearest we can say, it's associated with us. Now we can find a lot of similarities here between the embryo growing in the womb of the mother and the soul. A lot of similarities. And from this we can learn a great deal, looking again at the writings and looking at nature together, because as I said, these two things have to go together. Now, one of the similarities is this, that the cell is created at the time of conception. The first cell, if you look at it, there is nothing that you can see in the form of limbs or organs or anything. But that cell has the capacity to grow, to multiply, to acquire limbs and organs, so that after a period of, say, 9 months, for instance, it will have you will have a perfect human being from that cell. It has all the capacities to acquire limbs and organs. But when you look at the cell, there's nothing really unusual about it. It's just a cell. Now the soul is the same. When the soul comes to us first, at the time of conception, it has no qualities and perfections. It has no virtues. It has no knowledge. It has no wisdom. But it has the capacity, during a period of, say, 70, 80, 100 years that we live in this world, to acquire these qualities and perfections. It's just like the cell in the embryo, isn't it? You see now the similarities? You can see how these two things are really counterparts of each other. Another similarity is that when the cell is growing in the womb of the mother, it is not designed to live there, to stay there all its existence, all the period of its existence, but that it's only there for a very short period. This is not its home. The womb of the mother is not the home for the body of man. It's not its home. It's only a temporary place for it to acquire limbs and organs. That's all it is, pardon. Now exactly the same thing applies to the soul. This world which we live in is really a womb world. Is a womb world for the soul. As if each one of us is pregnant with the soul. Each one of us have the soul in our custody, like, shall we say, like preserving it, so that during this period of 100 years, 80 years that we live, or 60 years that we live, our soul may acquire qualities and perfections. But this is not its home. It's a stranger. Really, it's a stranger here. In the same way that the child in the womb of the mother is a stranger there. That's not its place. Now, we go further on, and we can go and find out more similarities. Another similarity is that when they look at the cell growing in the womb of the mother first, it is really very insignificant. Very insignificant. I mean, a cell is not significant at all, and nobody even notices it. It is so unnoticeable. You have to have a microscope to examine it. So, and yet, look at what happens 9 months later. You have a person. It has developed into a person. It has all the faculties of a man. See the difference between the first day and the last day? The entry into the womb, or the creation in the womb, and the emerging from the womb. You see that? The difference between the two stages? And it's the same thing with our soul. The day that we are conceived and the soul is created, as I said, it has no identity. There's no personality. It has no individuality really, but it will acquire this. Acquire qualities, perfections, individuality. And Baha'u'llah says that we will retain our individuality and personalities in the next life. So that you are yourself. It's not something that you lose. You are yourself. And he says that the holy souls will associate with all the souls, the holy souls, the prophets, and describe in the next life all their sufferings in the path of God, and all their joys and all their hardships that they have carried on in this life. So you see, it's not something that you will forget. It's something that you have an identity, individuality. And Baha'u'llah mentions, now this is a very beautiful thought, that the soul which comes into being will last, although it has a beginning, and that is when one is conceived, but it has no end. That it will grow and it will progress as long as God exists in the spiritual worlds of God. So you see what a beautiful thing it is to bring children into the world, so that you have a child coming into the world, a soul which is going to be there till eternity. And another feature, which again is part of the teachings of our faith, the soul is indestructible. You cannot destroy it once it is created. It belongs to the spiritual worlds of God. And at whatever stage you dissociate it from the body, whether it is at the time that the child even growing in the womb of the mother, if there is a miscarriage, you cannot destroy the soul. The soul is will grow in the spiritual worlds of God. It has not had the chance to acquire qualities and perfections here, but we are told that God will compensate this. So it's not something which is lost. A child who dies at a young age is the same. He has no chance to develop qualities and perfections, but that it will grow through the bounties of God. And God will compensate for the things that he had not been able to acquire in this life. Now, there are other similarities. We go a little further, and we find that our soul, the body, first of all, when we look at the body, we find that, as I mentioned this before, the womb of the mother is not a place for it to live. And the soul also, this is not its place. This home is very much a strange place for it, this world. It's like being a bird which is kept in a cage. This is another example that Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha have given in their teachings. That they have given us an example of a bird being kept in a cage. The bird does not belong to the cage. The bird is there in the cage to be fed, to be nourished, so that when the cage breaks, it can take its flight into its own realms. And so again we come to the same conclusion, that this period of life that we go through, that our soul is in this womb world, really, and it is here to acquire qualities and perfections. To acquire love, to acquire knowledge, to acquire wisdom, to be loving. Another similarity is that when the child is in the womb of the mother, it acquires limbs and organs there, but those limbs and organs are not really needed in the womb world. Cannot use them there. It's not really of any benefit to him. He uses a little bit of it. For instance, he moves his muscles, moves a little bit of a movement. You see, but he cannot really, it's not a place for using it. You see, the child, for instance, towards the end, has got perfect eyes, but it cannot see because there is no light. But when it is born, all these limbs and organs which were useless to him, and he could never conceive what it is for, will find some use, and he'll begin to use them. The eyes now become perfect instruments for seeing. You see, the phenomena of seeing is a marvelous phenomena when you look at it. Can you imagine if nobody could ever see, if there was no such a thing as sight? We would be deprived of knowing something about the light. But the light comes, and the combination of the two makes us see, and there we know one of the attributes of God is the all-seeing God, and then we know something of the attributes of God. But you see, these limbs and organs are not useful in the womb world, but it will be useful when it is born here. It's the same thing with us, with the soul. All the qualities and perfections that the soul acquires in this life, in this life of 70 or 80 years, as I refer to it, I don't know what is the duration of life in this country. I don't know how many years people live. I think people may live longer lives than other countries. I know when I was a young person, people used to live to the age of 102, 103, you see, 110. But in here, probably people don't live that long. I'm going to tell you a little story came to my mind. It's not an authentic story. It's one of those pilgrim's notes, and don't ever take note of it. But it is one of those funny things that Shoghi Effendi had a great sense of humor, and he used to tell us that he's told one of the pilgrims about the American way of life. Now, it's no way to belittle anything, but he was telling this pilgrims, he said in a humorous vein, he says that the American male works very hard to please his wife. Now, I don't know if it's true or not. And he works very, very hard, and he provides all the facilities and means and comfort for his wife and family. And the poor man comes home tired and exhausted, and his wife is full of energy, and he wants to take her out to go to theaters, to do these places and enjoy themselves. And so the man, of course, will go and will oblige his wife. And then, as a result of all this hard work, he dies at a younger age. And the woman becomes a rich person, travels around the world. Well, these are some of the stories. Often Shoghi Effendi made a lot of humorous remarks. Baha'u'llah had also a great sense of humor. You must not think that he did not have a sense of humor, a great sense of humor. Abdul Baha had a sense of humor. The believers used to have a sense of humor, and those who had the capacity to come to Baha'u'llah, to Abdul Baha, and make some humorous remarks which would make them all laugh. This was one of those characteristics. I tell you, now that I said about the Americans, let me go tell you everything. Shoghi Effendi had said to another pilgrim something story. I've heard this now. I don't know whether it's true or not. He was trying to describe again the various nations and how each nation has its own characteristics. And he said that in America, women dominate over men. I hope you don't mind me saying this. They rule over their husbands. In Germany, he said, it's the opposite. It's the men who are. He said in England, it's quite a balance. He said it's not a bad thing if if an American woman married a German man and they lived in England. So here we are. So, well, we were talking about the soul. I don't know what happened. We went out of it. But, you know, one of those things that I wanted to mention about the soul is that we were saying that the limbs and organs which the child acquires in the womb of the mother are not needed there. But in this life, it's the same thing with the soul, really. These qualities and perfections that we acquire, love, unity, brotherhood, kindness, generosity, knowledge, although we can use it in here in this life somehow to our advantage, they are really needed in the next life. They are for the next life that we acquire these qualities and perfections. And even if you don't use these qualities and perfections in this life, you still can live. In fact, this is what happens with most people today. People hate, people kill, and they still can live. They don't use those qualities in this life, and they still can live. But the real place, the real use of all these perfections and qualities that we have to acquire, the real use of them is not here, it's in the next life. All these perfections and qualities and virtues that we must acquire becomes like our spiritual limbs and organs in the next life. It will become active. Just like the eyes, which are not active in the womb of the mother, and suddenly because the light comes up and it becomes a very marvelous instrument, our acquiring of the quality of love, for instance, in the next life will become just an instrument through which we can progress. And if we don't acquire them in here, then we cannot use them in the next life. Because there is another similarity. And that similarity is this: that the child must acquire limbs and organs in the womb of the mother. If it does not, it cannot acquire them in this life. If you do not have an eye, or if you do not have an arm, you can't acquire them in this life. You are handicapped. You will grow, but you're handicapped. And the same thing we understand is true in the spiritual sense, that the soul must acquire these qualities and perfections in this life. That is why God has brought the body and the soul together. That's why He has decreed that we should live a period of 60, 70, 100 years here to acquire these qualities and perfections, so that these qualities and perfections become instruments of growth for us in the next life. And that if we do not acquire them here, we cannot acquire them in the next life. That's all we understand. And remember, we are not trying to say in these talks and in these studies that we can understand the soul now. Let me, first of all, I should have said this in the beginning. Don't think that by hearing these talks, on studying the writings, no matter how much deeply you study the soul, you will never understand what the soul is. This is only the impressions we get of the soul. These are impressions. This is as far as man in this life can understand the soul. We are limited in our understanding and vision. We cannot understand everything spiritual. We haven't got the tools for it in this life. It's in the next life that we will see the true reality of our souls. But it is hidden from us, because there is yet another similarity which I want to mention to you. And that similarity between the two things, between the embryo and the soul, is this: that if ever the child has not got the capacity to understand what a small place he's living in, what a limited place, a dark place he's living in during the period that he is growing in the womb of the mother, he has no capacity to understand that. He has no capacity to understand what a great world expects him to be born into. The vastness, the glory, the greatness of this world, he cannot see. Impossible for him to see, because God has not given him the capacity to understand this. The same God has not given our soul the capacity to understand anything about the greatness of the world which awaits us, the spiritual worlds of God. And in fact, Baha'u'llah mentions that if ever the glory of the next life was revealed to the extent of a needle's eye, then man would commit suicide. In the same way that if a child knew what a small place is living in and what a vast place is awaiting him, that child, you couldn't live there, you would have a revolution there. Really. Wouldn't want to live there. But God, the same God which has not given the child a capacity to appreciate that period, is completely ignorant about it. We are the same in that sense, because we will never be able to know our soul. In fact, there is a passage in Islam which says, if you want to know God, you should know yourself. They have asked Baha'u'llah, what does this mean? He says it means that when you look at yourself, you will find everything you have in your body is a manifestation of the soul. For instance, your eyesight is a manifestation of the soul in the body. Your hearing is a manifestation of the soul. All your senses are the manifestations of the soul in the body. Your brain is a manifestation of the soul in the body. But he says, your heart, which loves, is a manifestation of the soul in your body. But he says, if you add all these manifestations together, the sum total does not become the soul. And then he says, what is the soul? And then he says, if you live as long as thousands of years, and if all the peoples of the world put their thoughts together, they shall never know what that soul is. And he says, when you reach to that conclusion that you will never understand your soul, the reality of the soul, the essence of your soul, then you will say to yourself, how can I ever know the essence of my God who has created that soul? And you realize your impotence to recognize the essence of God. And he says, when you reach to that stage, the knowledge of God has dawned on you. This is when you begin to know God, when you realize that you will never know him. Impossible to know the essence of God. The essence of God is hidden from the eyes of men. We can never reach it. In fact, Baha'u'llah mentions that manifestations of God have no understanding of the essence of God. Because if they did, they would be partners with him. The manifestations of God have no access to the essence of God. You know, you read some of the passages that Shoghi Effendi has translated in English. He says 10,000 Moses is thunderstruck, I'm paraphrasing his words, at the Sinai of God's revelation, not knowing his essence. And 10,000 prophets as great as Jesus are dismayed at this thought of not thou, mine essence thou shalt never know. This is the call they get from God. My essence thou shalt not know. Baha'u'llah mentions, says 10,000 prophets as great as Jesus stand dismayed at the threshold of God, hearing this voice, thou shalt never know my essence. Now this indicates that the essence of God is beyond the comprehension of anything. Can never rise to that. He is the creator, and the creator must always stand above his creation. If it was, then we would be equal with him. If the mind could ever grasp anything, it means you are equal with that thing. You can only understand something which is either below you or on the same level as you. You can never understand something above you. It's impossible. So now, Baha'u'llah says this is the meaning. When you realize that you cannot know your own soul, the essence of your soul, then you can say, well, how can I know the essence of my God who has created my soul? Impossible. Now we go a little bit further. Let me take you a little further. Now, what time do we close this session, Mr. Chairman? 12. What time is it now? Oh, yes. 12. But you can't carry on. You mean the first session is going till 12 o'clock? You are very great people. You mean you can listen to all this? Well, anytime you get, there's no break between it, no. Yeah, all right. Well, we'll see. If I see you yawning, and then I'll say, all right, we'll have a break. Actually, if anybody wants to have a little doze off or something, or go to a little bit of sleep, go and sit in the back rows, because you can never see them. That's what they are doing there probably now, in the back rows. Now, I will come back to your questions, if I may. If you just wait till I finish this subject, you might find your questions are answered, probably, because we haven't even touched upon the subject.
Excuse me, this is not a question about the subject. Why you were digressing a little bit, I wanted to say that when I drove up, someone's ego in the parking lot had this emergency light.
Well, now, friends, we come to another similarity here between the embryo and the soul. And that is that when a child is born, it can bring with him whatever it has. It cannot bring anything that it hasn't. It just brings with him whatever it has. And in fact, in one of his tablets, Baha'u'llah says, if you needed anything else in this world, I would have given it to you there, the womb of the mother. Now, it's the same thing with the soul. The soul can take with him whatever it has. But you can't take with you anything which is bad. Because bad does not exist in itself. It has no existence. Now, don't take me wrong and say that I said... You have 1 cent or you have $1. That's a very small amount of money. This is the meaning of poverty. But whatever you have is positive. And that's what you can take with you. A murderer, for instance, is a person who has impoverished his soul. Well, he can take with him a little bit of good. A saint is a person who has got a lot of good qualities and perfections, and he carries with it to the next life. And therefore, each one of them is like having a capital. You begin your life with a capital. One is a very small capital, one is a large capital. And everyone grows in the spiritual worlds of God. There is no such thing as eternal damnation. Well, there are some souls which we know are diseased in this life, and this is the only one which God has indicated will not be forgiven. And that is the souls of the covenant breakers. In the Christian theology, it is those who sin against the Holy Ghost. And I may, if there is chance, I will explain to you really what is a covenant breaker, as we Baha'is talk about it in this, in nature, looking at nature, not to look at the philosophy of covenant breaking, because we have no time for it in the faith, but nature. Again, as I said, you can, everything in the faith, you can look at nature and find out these things. You can find out what covenant breaking is in nature. Now, we don't go into that subject now, but maybe I'll make a note of it here and sometime we can bring it up. So you see, every soul begins its spiritual life depending on its own qualities and perfections that it has acquired in this life. And this is why Baha'u'llah says that in the next life, the souls will be graded. We will be separated. Each one of us, in accordance with his own accomplishments in this life, will attain a certain position, a certain grade, a certain level. And he says those who are on a high level will encompass those who are on a lower level, and will completely understand them and will encompass them. And those who are on a lower level will not understand anything about those who are on a higher level. And their life in relation to them, to those who are on a higher level, is like non-existence. Now this exactly applies in nature. Exactly. You look at nature, you will find God has created in this nature great many levels of creation. First of all, there are several kingdoms. There is the mineral kingdom, there is the vegetable kingdom, there is the animal kingdom, there is the kingdom of man, And yet within each one of these kingdoms there are grades. Look at the animal kingdom. There are so many grades. On one end of the scale, you come across a creature like a worm, for instance. A worm is an animal. And on the other end of the scale, you come across the intelligent animals. And in between, there are enormous number of animals of different degrees, you see. And God seems to love this different levels. He loves to have this difference in His creation. We may not love it. I often say to myself, really, if we were God, we would have... it's a pity to, for instance, look at creatures like a mouse, for instance. What a terrible thing to be a mouse instead of being a man. Can you imagine he could have been a man? But it's a mouse. Now, God still likes this. He likes the mouse. He likes to have a mouse and He likes to have a man. He likes to have different grades. And it's the same thing in the spiritual worlds of God. We are going to be graded. And the life of a worm in relation to the life of another high intelligent animal is like death in relation to life. Really. But it has its life. It's not dead. The worm is not dead. It has life. But its life in relation to the life of a dog, for instance, is like death in relation to life. And so it is the same thing we understand in the spiritual realms, that the souls will be graded in accordance with what qualities we have acquired. As I told you, we cannot take bad things with us to the next life, but whatever good things we can take, those good things will determine the level in which we are going to be. Now, another important question, which again we can find it from nature and looking at the writings, of course. As I mentioned before, we must look at these two things always. And from that we learn a lot of things. Is that when you look at where is the next life? Where is the next world? Now, if you want to know that, look at nature. Nature will answer you. When you look at the child in the womb of the mother, we said that the embryo, remember, growing in the womb of the mother and the soul are counterparts of each other. When you look at the child in the womb of the mother, where is he when he's growing in the womb world? Where is he? He's here. Isn't he? He's in this world, really. The distance is very little. There is only a barrier which prevents him from being in this world. But he's here. He's carried with his mother around. Have you ever seen in a farm an egg breaking and a chicken comes out? Where was the chicken before the egg breaks? It was there. But it couldn't realize it itself until the shell breaks. So Baha'u'llah tells us that the next world is here. It's closer to us than we can ever imagine. But it is closed before our eyes. And as I mentioned before, Baha'u'llah says if we could only perceive to the extent of a needle's eye the greatness and the glory of the next life, then we would want to commit suicide to get there. So you can see here how the next life, the next world is just beside us. And then there is another thing we learn from the child in the womb of the mother, and that is this, that once the child is growing in the womb of the mother, there are many people who are involved in caring for that child. The mother is the first person who really is enabling the child to grow. The father, the mother, the relatives, the doctors, the nurses, the community, all of them are paying attention and working hard for enabling that child to grow once it is in the womb of the mother. And we are told it's the same thing in this life, in relation to the holy souls which have passed away. They are the cause of all the growth and development which takes place in this life. But you remember I was saying to you, it's a one-way communication. They encompass us, they help us, they inspire us in ways that we have no way of understanding it. Baha'u'llah mentions that martyrs of the faith will produce such an effect upon the growth and development of this world, that although that he says that even though that it takes place rarely, it will produce tremendous results in this life. It's just like the care, the attention, the love which the parents, the community has for the child growing in the womb of the mother. But as I mentioned to you, we cannot take with us into the next life anything which is bad, because bad does not exist in its own outward sense. So the souls which are gone on in the next life, everything they can do to us is for our good. They have no bad things. They cannot influence us in a bad way. They can only influence us in a good way. And if it is anything which we want, which is bad for us, they can't give it to you. They can only give you what is good for you. And what is good for you sometimes may be sufferings. Maybe it is sufferings. The more our souls suffer, the more it becomes ready to absorb spiritual powers to itself. Suffering in the path of God. Bearing those sacrifices we do, whatever realm it may be, in whatever field, you sacrifice something. You give up your time. You're tired, but you give up your time. You go and teach the people. You go and promote the faith, but you go through a great deal of hardship. That is good for the soul. That enables the soul to grow. And the concourse on high, those holy souls which are passed away from this life, they will assist us if we walk in the right way. But as soon as you want to go in the wrong way, they cannot assist you, because they cannot influence us in a bad way. Now I am going to now go into another aspect of the soul. And maybe before I do that, so far we can go on and talk about this quite a lot. But I think we have got an idea here. Maybe it's not a bad thing at this point that if you had any questions about what I have said which you have not understood it, maybe we can talk about it now. And then we will go to another aspect of the soul which is very important, because all these things that we have said so far about the soul coming to us from the worlds of God, we said from the spiritual realms, we said that the soul has to acquire qualities and perfections here. We said how everything in this life has a counterpart. In the spiritual worlds, anything physical is a counterpart of something spiritual. We discussed all these things, and there we were able to get some idea, only an idea, an impression of what the soul is and its qualities and powers are. But now, and we said that the purpose of life so far is to acquire qualities and perfections. But there is a greater purpose in our creation, far greater from acquiring qualities and perfections. Far greater. And again, in order to understand that, I'll take you to nature again. But before we enter into this subject, let us see if there is anything so far which you want to comment about or question. Now, I'm not referring to those people who are sitting in the back row who probably are asleep. But that's a place if you want to rest, that's a good place. We have this game in Europe. When we have classes, we often say, now look here, go into the back row. It's a good place to be. Right. Well, it seems to me there is no... Yes?
On the grades or levels of the soul after
Pardon?
When one person dies and then their soul goes on and then it's graded level,
Yes?
put on a different level, is the higher grade, the more chance you might be put back to work in this world as a servant?
I don't know. One thing we do.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to more content on the Oneness Movement, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment. See you next time.